It's time to break into legal academia with Break Into Tax. I'm Leandra Lederman, and joining me today is Jeremy Barrafront, Associate Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School.
So we're here to talk about how you break into legal academia. We're going to focus primarily on getting a position as a tenure stream doctrinal faculty member. There are a wide range of positions within law schools. They can include clinical positions, legal writing positions, and those may or may not be tenured. There's also a relatively new type of category of professor called a professor of practice that is not typically a tenured or tenure-track position. And there's also visiting positions, including visiting assistant professor positions, which we'll talk about.
I think it's worth noting that describing how this process has often worked is different from endorsing it. I would like to see a number of changes to how, in the long term, as a profession, we make sure that it's not a gated community. Nevertheless, so I want to share information about how the process often works.
Yeah, these are generalities. These are based on our experiences. Your mileage may vary. So let's start by just sharing our background so you have an idea of what we did before we became law professors.
I started out first as an associate at a tax boutique here in Washington, D.C., Ivins, Phillips & Barker. From there, I went to the Hill and I served as tax counsel to Senator Elizabeth Warren. And from the Senate, I then did a fellowship at NYU, their acting assistant professor of tax law fellowship for 2 years. And I did the job market from that fellowship and landed in this tenure-track position at GW.
I graduated from law school with my JD in 1990, and then I went to work at White & Case in New York City as an associate. After a couple of years, I went back to NYU and I got my LLM in taxation. And then I clerked for a U.S. tax court judge, Judge Laro in Washington, D.C., and then I went on the teaching market. And my first teaching position was at Mercer Law School, where I was an untenured assistant professor. I stayed there for 3 years. I moved then to George Mason Law School, first as a visitor, and I stayed ultimately for 7 years, minus 1 year visiting at the University of Texas. And then I moved to Indiana University, first as a visitor, and have stayed there the rest of my career since 2004, minus the fall of 2015, where I visited at the University of Chicago. I have been on faculty hiring committees at more than one school, and I have chaired our appointments committee at Maurer.
So I think a good place for us to start as we discuss the path into legal academia is the self-assessment piece of it. How do you know that being a law professor might be a good fit for you? What students see is a very narrow slice of academic life. And the biggest piece that's missing is all the time we spend alone at our computers writing our articles. So the most time-consuming part of my job, frankly, is my writing. And that's something that you have to be passionate about for this to be the right fit.
That's right. In general, the law professor's job has 3 parts: teaching, research, and service. And the service component may be largely invisible. There is internal service to the law school or to the university, which could be something like serving on committees such as the faculty hiring committee, for example. And it could also be local, state, or national or international service, such as being involved in professional organizations, such as the Association of American Law Schools or the American Bar Association, just to name a couple.
Right. And also service to colleagues, commenting on papers that they send you, serving as a reviewer to a law review or to another journal. We're constantly reading each other's work and commenting on it.
It's not a leisurely job.
No, I find vacations, in the sense of vacations from teaching, are my busiest times of year. It's when I have even more writing deadlines that I need to meet. The work emails that I've gotten over the course of my career on Thanksgiving Day have tended to be from other academics who are also using holidays to do additional work.
So let's say you're a law student and you're thinking, I would eventually like to have a career in legal academia. What should I do? In general, Law faculty generally went to strong law schools, did well there, often were on law review or another journal, often had a judicial clerkship, often have some practice experience, but not years and years of practice experience. And then they often start through a VAP or fellowship, and they generally have some published legal scholarship. But of course, there are exceptions, and many people have multiple exceptions.
And just to point out one of the exceptions, for example, I didn't apply to law review and I didn't apply for clerkships. I knew I loved tax and I wanted to spend whatever extra time that I had control over on tax-focused things. So there's no requirement. It's more about patterns. And one of the best resources on this is Sarah Lawsky's annual entry-level hiring report. Professor Lawsky's at Northwestern, and she prepares an incredible resource for entry-level candidates to see what are the credentials of individuals who go on the market and then successfully get a placement. The entry-level hiring report is posted on the Prof's blog. Here you can see what percentage of candidates had clerkships, which percentage had advanced degrees and fellowships, and you see 8 out of 10 had a fellowship. So that's probably the biggest common trend. I recommend that, and you can even see the embedded spreadsheet where you could look at the entry-level candidates and you could see where they went to law school and where they were hired. And there's a range. It's also even international. There are some who went to law school outside the US.
How do you prepare yourself for the academic market? I often get that question. And if you want to be a tenure-track professor, the best thing that you can do to augment the credentials that you already have is to write. So sometimes I get the question of, well, I have an opportunity to do adjunct teaching. Should I take that opportunity? Well, to be clear, adjunct teaching is not a foot in the door to a tenure-track position. The tenure-track market is a national market. It doesn't hurt to have teaching experience, but it's not expected. So if you have finite time, you're much better off putting that time into an article or another article than spending it preparing and teaching a class as an adjunct professor.
Right. And that's true even if the specific school you wanted to get the tenure-track job at is the one that asks you to adjunct. The appointments committee might not even know who is adjuncting at any given time. And the connections you'll make will be with students in the classroom, not with other faculty.
And not all of the various types of positions focus on scholarship, but the tenure stream positions definitely do. Sometimes I've heard about successful attorneys who think about, quote unquote, retiring into teaching, and they think that tenured faculty members focus primarily on teaching, and that what really is needed is bringing a wealth of practice experience. And that's not actually the main qualification for the position.
I've heard from a partner at a very successful law firm. They're at the top of their field, but if they were to apply to be a law professor, they would probably be ineligible at most schools because they haven't published law review articles. It's just a different credential. The fact that they hadn't demonstrated a career of scholarship just meant that they weren't a good fit to be hired to do scholarship.
Yeah, that's where a professor of practice role has come along. And I think it's fair to say that that's true at most law schools, that in general, in the current market, schools are probably going to be looking for some record of scholarship. And the standards have risen since the time that I was on the market decades ago. Connected with that, there's been a huge growth in VAPs and fellowships that are designed to give candidates the time and opportunity to write and to prepare themselves for the academic market.
Right. Fellowships now are something that I think over 80% of entry-level hires did. So they've really become the standard. And of course, even applying to fellowships, likely it's become more competitive. And so now I believe some fellowships want to see a scholarship track record to apply for a fellowship. This brings out one other self-assessment question that I think is important to consider before we go into the strategy of being on the entry-level market. And that's just checking with yourself about whether you're open to a career where you can't choose where you live. And it's just part of the job. I love being a law professor and I love being at GW, but something that's true for pretty much everyone is that we don't get to decide what law school hires us. It's not like applying to law schools where you have your list of favorites and you choose your school. Even if you have multiple offers, you won't know in advance what schools those offers are going to come from, who's hiring in your field. You just, for the love of the job, end up moving around.
It's really true. And I think that is harder for people who are partnered, where their partner has a career. And it can be even harder for people with kids, depending on how old the kids are, et cetera.
And one reason for it is that law schools care about their reputation amongst other law schools. And if a candidate has been getting a lot of attention from other schools, and that demonstrates that, okay, if we hire them, other schools will be impressed by us.
There definitely are stories of people who are geographically limited and are still very successful. And certainly if you are the superstar, you have many more options and you might be able to choose exactly where you want to live, but it is a national market. So I think that's exactly right, that for most people, they are not living their first choice location. And if they want to change schools for some reason, they're moving geographic areas as well.
I'm very happy in Washington, D.C., but I kind of had to be real with myself and with my husband at the start of the process that we just didn't know where I was going to get a job.
Let's talk about how you get your first academic job. One very common place that people start, as you mentioned, Jeremy, is with a VAP or a fellowship. So could you talk a bit about the process for getting one of those?
So I knew that I wanted to teach tax as part of my fellowship. I was ultimately going to be a tax professor, and I wanted to be building up that credential. So for me, the NYU fellowship was really the only option because they were going to put me in the tax classroom. Most fellowships are structured around legal research and writing coursework. And so in your fellowship, you'll be teaching those writing classes. And then there are fellowships where you don't have any teaching responsibilities at all. You just get to write full time. That has advantages because it's more time for your research. The disadvantage is when you ultimately go on the market, you can't point to these teaching evaluations that demonstrate your proven ability in the classroom. So there's trade-offs.
The fellowships that involve teaching legal writing, those are not necessarily intended for folks who are going to go on the market as legal writing professors. They're a way for entry-level candidates to get experience teaching, get some time to write and mentoring with their writing, while at the same time helping out a law school by teaching legal writing classes.
Absolutely. I went to law school at Stanford. Our legal research and writing courses, most were taught by fellows who are now professors at UCLA and Arizona State. They went into doctrinal fields. There are schools that don't actually have tenure lines, but nevertheless have teaching needs and create fellowships to fill those gaps.
That's right. And the same thing is true with visiting assistant professor positions. That sometimes you have visiting assistant professor positions that might be something like teach 2 classes each semester for a year or for 2 years. And for someone who's new to academia, there is a ton of class prep, and that's not going to really provide time to write. It's just basically an opportunity for the school to have someone cover classes and an opportunity for that person to get a taste of legal academia.
Right. And this reminds me of another trap to be wary of as a fellow. I can share a mistake I made. I'm a tax person. I love to read tax and write about tax. And so in my fellowship, I made sure to get to know the other tax professors. And I had a wonderful community of other tax colleagues to chat with about my work and get comments. But I didn't really reach out to anyone who wasn't a tax professor. And the way legal hiring works is actually most people who are going to be voting on your candidacy aren't even going to be in your field. Most hiring committees are general. They represent many different areas of the law. And typically someone who's an expert in your area will certainly have veto power over whether you can hire. But in the end, it's how your work can communicate beyond your field that's really essential.
There's a really helpful AALS website listing VAPs and fellowships. and we'll include in the description a link to this and other resources.
We should talk about what does the hiring process look like from our side of the desk, and then that will help inform what the prospective law professor should do to prepare. The way hiring happens in legal academia is that there's a faculty committee that might be, let's say, approximately 5 or 6 people. One of the committee members is the chair, and the faculty committee will consider the CVs of the various candidates and usually invite a number of candidates for screening interviews, usually at the hiring conference in Washington, D.C. And then of those, the ones that make the most favorable impression, the committee will invite to campus to do what's usually about a day and a half long interview process with the whole faculty, where there will be small group interviews and there will be probably a lunch and a dinner. There might be a meeting with some students, and the centerpiece typically is a presentation of a work in progress that's colloquially known as the job talk. So because this is a national market and you have schools competing with each other, there's a centralized hiring process that a lot of candidates go through, which is what's colloquially known as the meat market. AALS, the Association of American Law Schools, runs this basically job fair, typically in Washington, D.C.
This is something I only learned about after I started my fellowship at NYU, but the way that this national hiring market works, it requires you to submit a FAR form, sort of abbreviated resume, but with some additional documents that then is circulated with all hiring committees. And so they get hundreds of candidates, and the committees go through that to decide who they're going to screen for an interview.
The FAR is the Faculty Appointments Register. And for the past quite a few years, it's existed in the form of a database. So the candidates fill out their information, and then the hiring committee members can do searches. So we can search for things like people who have at least one published work. There's some potential pitfalls. You don't want to leave that line blank if you have a published work, for example, because then you simply won't show up in the search.
So one way to exclude is based on publication, but another way to exclude is based on classes that you're willing to teach. So you do have to be very thoughtful in your list. And I think you can have up to 10 classes that you would teach. So don't waste any of those slots. Come up with 10 to fill each one, because that's a different search term that could get you considered.
Yeah, so some schools are really looking for a professor in a particular doctrinal area. Maybe they had 2 tax professors and one of them is leaving and they want to fill a tax position. Some schools may, however, have money to hire for the sort of the best candidate that they find. And it's not necessarily specific to any subject area, or they might have some mild preferences, and certain areas might be very well covered already, but they have a lot of flexibility.
Often the central university is the one who's decided what funds they can have for taking on a new tenure line, and they might just not have any flexibility. It could be exclusively for a business law person or exclusively for a property law person, or it could be open. That's something that the appointments chair doesn't necessarily control. Leandra, do committees also hear from candidates' recommenders saying that they should get a special look or they should get out of the main pile?
Yes. So it's not uncommon for faculty to contact the hiring chair or someone else on the hiring committee and recommend certain candidates.
And so when asking for help from a recommender or asking for someone to be your recommender, they probably know that it's not only answering the phone if they get a call from a committee, but it might require some proactive work, and you shouldn't be too shy and frankly in asking for that.
You probably want to be judicious about that. You probably don't want your recommender to blanket every law school. So you might mention to your recommender that you're particularly interested in certain schools. There might be ones, for example, that are advertising that they're going to be hiring in your field, or there might be a particular geographic region that's a preference for you. And so you might ask your recommender if that person could reach out to the schools that are in that region and try to facilitate that. Like if you can find out who the hiring chair is, provide that person's email address to your recommender, et cetera.
Exactly. And it helps to have those names because faculty often might know each other. And so the recommender in the end might only be comfortable reaching out to the person they already know. But that's still great. That's more than reaching out to nobody, right?
So the Faculty Appointments Committee, in my experience, is not only passive, sort of waiting to be contacted or looking through the FAR database that the candidates have put their materials into. In my experience, the Appointments Committee also reaches out pretty widely to try to broaden the pool as much as possible. So reaching out to people that they know at other schools, asking about prospective candidates. And a lot of times there, what you would hear mostly about would be prospective lateral candidates, but people may also know of folks who aren't on the market yet, but might be planning to go on the market. Let's say you receive some interviews. So these will be typically 20-minute screening interviews. And outside the pandemic, they're typically at the Marriott Wardman Park in Washington, D.C. Basically, what we do is we have it's usually 2 days or even 2.5 days broken up into 30-minute slots. And maybe we have an hour break for lunch, but we're just basically interviewing people all day long, one after another. The Faculty Appointments Committee will be tired, and a lot of times the candidates will be tired as well, because if you're fortunate enough to get a lot of interviews, you may not have a lot of flexibility about whether you schedule them back to back.
Right. And committees are understanding about everyone being rushed and they get it, but nevertheless, that's your one shot to present yourself. So it's demanding. And I really did frankly make a mistake in that I was offered some screener interviews before AALS. A few schools that were nearby where I was living had reached out saying, oh, would you like to interview with us beforehand? And I thought it would give me more scheduling flexibility. So I said yes, but the downside was that I wasn't prepared for those. I hadn't prepared in the same way I was for the main market. And I didn't get a call back at any of those schools. So it showed that you've got to practice, find at least one mentor recommender who you can do a mock interview with.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think actually interviews before the meat market are becoming more common as schools try to compete with each other. If you're in a fellowship, there should be someone who will be able to do a mock screening interview. And then also there's other resources like the Southeastern Association of Law Schools, SEALS. They have a lot of programming now for prospective law professors. They'll do mock interviews, they'll critique resumes, that kind of thing. It's not a particularly expensive conference. And that's something that, people can take advantage of to actually get feedback from other law professors.
Something to always keep in mind as going through the entry-level process is that legal academia is quite small. We're almost all repeat players with each other. And that applies not only to the people who are interviewing you, even if you don't end up going to their school, but also the other candidates who are doing interviews at the same time. I mean, those are your future colleagues, even if not at the same school. And those relationships are potentially one of the most rewarding parts of the job.
Yeah, so you don't want to burn bridges. And also interviewing at a lot of places gives you information about a lot of schools. Doing the screening interviews, you can start to see how different the approaches of schools are from one another, and you get something of a representation of what the vibe is at that particular school, and you can be very pleasantly surprised and sometimes also disappointed about what the faculty are like in an interview, as opposed to maybe kind of an abstract impression you had of the school.
So far, we've talked about figuring out if you want to be a law professor. And now we've also talked about being an entry-level candidate. And now Leandra is going to tell us more about the lateral market.
There are people who move from one law school to another, and that can happen with or without a visitorship. A school might be looking in a particular field and have someone come and visit where they're evaluating that person as a potential lateral hire, and that's what's called a look-see visit. There are other types of visits. So there's something called a podium visit or a teaching visit. You're coming and you're just teaching for the semester or the year and you're not being considered for a position. There's potentially other types of visits. I've done 2 other types. There are definitely schools which host a lot of visitors and where faculty do a lot of visitorships, and there are other schools where that's just less common. Sometimes people will visit somewhere and that will sort of signal to the market that they're mobile. Schools might have you on their radar because of the fact that you're doing a visitorship. Moving laterally, to me, is often a multi-year process. You might not get the particular lateral opportunity the first year that you start looking.
As an entry, you have the FAR form, so you can signal that you're looking just through that. But as a lateral, there's no FAR form.
Right, but AALS does a visitors register. You could potentially write to a school that you're interested in moving laterally, but because you're already on a law faculty, you probably know some other law professors. So it's common to just mention to your friends that you're potentially interested in moving, or ask someone you know on the faculty of a school you might be interested in if there's a need in your field or something like that. Because the lateral market tends to be done through networks, it can be particularly important to go to conferences and get to know people so that, first of all, you hear if there's going to be an opening at a particular school, and second of all, you can informally express interest.
Leandra, when you were lateraling from either Mercer or from George Mason, was that something you told your colleagues about at those schools?
I have always taken the approach that when I have an opportunity, I should tell the dean or the associate dean, even if I decline it. These are generalities. These are based on our experiences. Your mileage may vary. It pays to consult multiple people, but we hope that hearing from us about our experiences will be helpful as you break into legal academia.